No able-bodied person has any excuse to use a disabled parking bay. And I cannot believe I have to make this video. But here we are, so let's get into it. Greetings all and welcome to The Pivot Point. I'm Tyron Harding. Ending up in a wheelchair 5 years ago, I had quite a few frustrations. One of the first major things I want to cover is people misusing the disabled parking bays. And even people with disabilities can get this wrong at times. So let me share information so that we understand the concept better. Now, if you're already thinking, but you had a valid excuse to be in the disabled parking bay, this video might be for you. I've heard it all, that I'm just going to be 2 minutes, or I'm just waiting for my spouse, or I just have to unload something from my car quick. These aren't valid reasons for able-bodied people to be parking in disabled parking spaces. The only reason being if you are accompanying someone with a disability that requires that specific parking space. And I'm going to get into which disabilities do and don't require those parking spaces. There are two factors about these parking spots that we need as people with disabilities. The first factor is these bays are wider than a normal parking bay. For people with assistive devices, wheelchairs or crutches, we need more space to be able to get out of our vehicles. For me, I literally need to be able to unload my entire wheelchair next to the car and then get into the chair without damaging the vehicle next to me. The second factor is these parking spots are usually close to the entrance. For those with and without assistive devices, they might struggle with long distances and therefore putting them at the entrance just makes more sense. In the beginning, I was quite militant about this and I believed that it should only be for people in wheelchairs because we need that extra space. The more I learned about people with disabilities and the more educated I became, I started to understand that there are obviously other people with disabilities that don't require wheelchairs but would struggle as well. This made me realize that the problem comes down to the fact that everyone's trying to fit different types of disabilities into one parking spot. So it's wider for people like myself who need space to get into the wheelchair, but it's close to the entrance for people that struggle to walk long distances. So you get the elderly using these parking spots as well. This creates a lot of conflict and a lot of complications that really shouldn't arise. I'll never forget the first time I was upset about someone parking in a disabled parking bay. As I arrived at the center, two old ladies in a car pulled into the parking lot. My dad, who was driving me around at the time, parked the vehicle we were in, got out, went up to them and asked them, "Excuse me ladies, do you need the disabled parking spot? Because my son's in a wheelchair." And they said, "Yes, of course we need it." They both proceeded to get out of the vehicle and walk to the entrance. So the only reason they needed that parking space was because it was close to the front. Now this meant that my dad had to drop me off in the middle of the parking area because there was no parking space that was wide enough for me to get out of the vehicle. This led me to realize that we're trying to put people that struggle with mobility in these bays as well. But they could also be a little bit considerate because quite literally 2 bays away from that disabled parking bay was an open parking spot. These old ladies could have used that parking spot. It wasn't that far away from the entrance. It would also have left the disabled parking spot open for someone that needed the extra space to get out of the vehicle. It's not just the elderly or able-bodied people that misuse these parking spots. I've had it with people with disabilities misusing these parking spots. I remember one day leaving the rehab center where I was doing my physio, and as I got to the parking lot, there was a vehicle with 2 men in it. The passenger in the vehicle was shouting at the security guard and basically swearing at him because he wouldn't allow this vehicle to park in the disabled parking bay. So I roll up and try and inquire what's the problem, because obviously if they need the parking spot, the security should allow them. The security guard says they don't use a wheelchair. Okay, This is literally a hospital for patients with spinal cord injuries. Like, there's a lot of people in wheelchairs. So getting someone that's not in a wheelchair that wants to use the bay is unusual. So I then go and inquire from the passenger in the vehicle. He gets out and starts shouting at me and says, "I'm blind. I deserve to use this parking spot." Now, clearly, we were in slight disagreement because he was blind, yes. He had a disability, yes. There's no valid reason for him to need to use that parking bay. He didn't need a mobility device. He didn't have issues walking. Why does he need the parking bay? Simple answer, he felt entitled. And that is a different video in its own right. Then the second issue that I had was arriving at a center, and just before I'm about to pull into a disabled parking bay, someone speeds in, the guy gets out of his car and starts walking up the ramp. So I hooted him and asked him, "Sorry, do you mind moving your vehicle? I need that parking spot." He turns around and his words to me are, "I need crutches to walk. Would you like me to get the crutches out of the back of my car? Would that make you feel better?" "No," I said. "What would make me feel better is if you moved your car to the normal parking spots, because clearly you don't need a wider bay or close to the entrance." Again, people with disabilities feeling like the world owes them and being inconsiderate. Then the third issue with people with disabilities misusing these is people who have valid reasons to actually use those things but use them incorrectly. Now, one of the banes for me is if I go out with my wife and she's going to just quickly pop into the shop, I will not use the disabled parking bay because although I am in a wheelchair, I'm not getting out of the car, so I do not need that extra space. So then when you have a guy pitching up there, he's in a wheelchair, he was the specific case, his family gets out, they all go in, and he waits in the car for them to come out. He got upset with me for saying that he shouldn't be parking there if he's not using it correctly. Even people with disabilities can be the problem as well. We need to just be considerate of other people. I firmly believe that we should actually have 3 separate types of parkings. The first being for parents with children, specifically little children, babies. They have prams, they need more space next to their vehicles as well. It makes perfect sense that they need wider bays as well. Then we should have wheelchair parking spots for people with mobility devices that need extra space to get out of their vehicles. And the third is places that are close to the entrance but normal sized parking spots. People that struggle with mobility but don't need specific mobility devices. That way they're not far from the entrance and don't have to walk a mile to get inside. This makes sense to me. It's unlikely that we're ever going to get people to acknowledge this and put this in place, because whoever designs these places clearly sees it as wastage of space and not important to focus on. At the end of the day, I believe it's all about being considerate. If I'm not using that parking spot correctly, I'm not getting out of the vehicle, I'm being considerate by parking in a normal parking space so that someone might come along in a wheelchair or mobility issues and they might need that space that day. If you're an able-bodied person and you're considering parking there, even if it's to offload something or waiting for a spouse or just going to be 2 minutes, just be considerate and think of other people and realize that maybe you can take one for the team and park 10 meters that way. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one. And I figured, let me share information because even the disabled people can get it wrong at times. Someone's going to have an issue with the fact that I said disabled people.